It is attempting to connect. We can hope. Maybe redirecting, it says. No. Audio is working. Let's see if the video comes in. There we go. All right. The joy of technology. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing when it works. And it just takes a lot of extra effort to make it work. Okay, and we've only just hit 12 o'clock, so we can give it a minute before we get going. By way of preamble, we will be diving into the book of Bamidbar today, the journey through the wilderness, which is what Bamidbar literally means. Usually can sometimes be translated as the desert, but wilderness is a much better term in English, because the word desert in English really has a whole, Sahara sand dune kind of feel to it. Whereas the wilderness in Midbar sense means the unoccupied areas, the places that are uninhabitable, at least under normal circumstances. Of course, there were caravans and other travelers through this place because it connected Egypt to Asia, but no one made it their permanent home because it wasn't suitable to be a permanent home, especially at that time. But we are going to start our journey from Har Sinai, from Mount Sinai at that place, and move out. Now, you'll notice that I have the screen in a slightly different configuration. We have our good friend Rashi over here on the right. We have our good friend Rashbam over here, on the left. We have our Torah reading here next to Rashbam as usual. And then we have a guest column, Chizkuni. So Chizkuni is one of the great commentators from the 13th century, also from the French traditions. And his commentary I found to be a little extra informative on this particular chapter. As we'll see, both Rashi and Rashbam do not have much to say on this topic. In fact, after the first couple commentaries, we will close Rashbam's window and continue only with the other two. Chizkuni, on the other hand, draws from a wider source of pre-commentaries. Now, that's hard to know because unlike Rashbam, who will occasionally mention his grandfather, Rashi, or who will simply portray what he is putting as being his own interpretation of the Peshat, and Rashi, of course, where we will often find the citations for where he drew from, Chizkuni very consciously chose not to include citations in most places from other commentaries. Yes, he would make commentary about Talmud or Midrash or Mishnah, but when it comes to mentioning that he is basing his commentary on Rashi or Rashbam or Ibn Ezra or any of the other greats that preceded him, he does not include their names. Now, some of you might be objecting, B'Shem Omro, that we should always teach in the name of the person that we heard the teaching given in. However, Chizkuni makes a very good point, that he is worried that people are going to prefer commentaries from the more famous and well-respected commentators, and that will prejudice them when they are analyzing and understanding the text, that they will close themselves off from certain avenues of investigation, from asking certain questions, if they believe that the great commentators are not going down that route, or who have given an answer that they then should not be permitted to argue against. By presenting all of the commentary on an even playing field, he is asking the student to study and come to their best understanding, obviously still mediated with discussion with others, of what they feel are the best analysis. So if you are surprised to see Chizkuni here, don't be. He is a wonderful commentary. I do like to use him a lot, and when you go back through my back catalog, you'll see many of my study sheets draw from him heavily. But for today, I found that he was bringing some very interesting commentary that both Rashi and Rashbam were not touching on. Okay, so with that preamble and introduction out of the way, let's jump into the Torah text and get our commentaries moving. So we're beginning, as I said, in Bamidbar, the basic narrative so far, although we're going to jump a little bit, but the basic narrative so far is talking about the tabernacle having been completed, and that period of the first couple years at the foot of Mount Sinai is coming to its conclusion, which means, of course, that we are now getting ready to head on towards Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. So hopefully you now have the timeline roughly penciled in. On the first day of the second month in the second year following the exodus from the land of Egypt, Adonai spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, Bamidbar Sinai, where we get the name of both this parasha and book from, in the tent of meeting, saying, and the Ohel Moed, of course, was the tabernacle that was just completed. And so we know that was done not only as a site for sacrifices and for a place for the Aron HaKodesh, for the Holy Ark, but it was also a place where Moses would continue to receive additional revelation. And these are the instructions that we get. Take a census of the whole Israelite company, brackets of fighters, we'll come back to that, by the clans of its ancestral houses, listing the names by every male, head by head. You and Aaron shall record them by their groups from the age of 20 years up, all those in Israel who are able to bear arms. Associated with you shall be a participant from each tribe, each one the head of his ancestral house. Associated with you is a little flowery, it just says with you, that these other people will be. And again, more on that commentary as we go on. But before we get to the list, just make sure you understand the lay of the land, that God is asking Moses to take a census. And in particular, it is a census of the men that are of fighting age, meaning 20 years and up, those that are able to bear arms. Later on, we'll learn that there is a top limit as well in terms of when somebody retires from being capable of military service. But that seems to be the function. And then we get this list of the ancestral, of the people who will be joining Moses and Aaron from each of the different tribes. And as we'll see, the list is slightly long, and we'll do my best with the English versions of some of these names. You'll forgive me if I lapse back into the Hebrew, though, because I find the English of some of these names quite difficult. These are the names of the participants who shall assist you. From Reuben, Elitzur of Shedur. From Simeon, Shelumiel, son of Tzuri Shaddai. From Judah, Nachshon of Aminadav. From Issachar, Nathanael, son of Zuar. From Zebulun, Eliav, son of Helon. From the sons of Joseph. From Ephraim, Elishama, son of Amihud. From Manasseh, Gamliel, son of Pedahsur. Remember that Joseph had his two sons adopted by Jacob, and so they are added to this list individually, not just as Joseph himself. From Benjamin, Avidan ben Gidoni. From Dan, Achiezer ben Amishadai. From Asher, Pagiel ben Ochran. From Gad, Eliasaph ben Deuel. From Naphtali, Achira ben Enan. And those are the elected of the assembly, the chieftains of their ancestral tribes. They are the heads of the contingents of Israel. Now, before we get into verse 17, where Moses puts this into practice, let's just sort of whet our appetite. I know that many people, when they look at lists of names like this, their eyes begin to glaze over, and they start falling asleep. It seems like there's just a bunch of foreign names that are difficult to pronounce and don't seem to be adding much to the conversation. Well, that's why we have commentary. Not only to help us navigate the difficult halakha, not only to help us navigate the difficult narratives, but also to help us navigate what can feel like difficult genealogies or lists of people. These bookkeeping sections of the Torah are not to be neglected. There is much that we can learn from this, some of which may seem not immediately relevant to our lives, but still it is Torah and deserves our understanding and commentary, and some of which may surprisingly have relevance for our lives. So let's go ahead and jump into this discussion. So the first we're going to look at over here is Rashbam. Like I mentioned, I only want to look at a couple of his commentaries because he's not writing much on this chapter. But the first one is, I think, very illustrative of some of the brilliance that he brings to the commentary in general of the Torah. So he starts off with this question of Bamidbar Sinai be'ohel moed, that in the tent of meeting, in the wilderness of Sinai, and so on. All of the communications, instructions we heard about in the first year of the Israelites' wanderings, before the tabernacle had been erected, were characterized by the words Bahar Sinai, at Mount Sinai. So if you take yourself back to a few months ago as we were reading through the Torah, before the Mishkan was built, we know that all of those other communications that God and Moses would communicate in the language of the Torah, Bahar Sinai, at Mount Sinai. And what Rashbam is pointing out to us is that the words have changed. That it used to be that their communication took place at Mount Sinai. That was the standard technical phrase being used, even if we thought it was just, the little white subtitles they put on a movie to tell you that they're in Paris or something. But this was a more technical term than that. However, once the tabernacle had been erected on the first day of the first month of the second year, the words Bahar Sinai, as the source of legislation, do not appear again. So after the tabernacle is built, we stop seeing Bahar Sinai as the intro phrase or the location for where the conversation between Moses and God is happening. Instead, they are replaced by the words Bamidbar Sinai be'ohel moed, in the wilderness of Sinai, which is the entire area in that peninsula. And of course, now with the Ohel Moed, with the tent of meeting, with the tabernacle, the Mishkan. There's a long discussion about exactly how best to describe it, but that becomes the centerpiece for communication. The point is proved in Numbers chapter 3, verse 1, where the Torah, when referring to a date preceding the erection of the tabernacle, speaking of Aaron and his sons, naming 4 sons, adds the words at Mount Sinai, Bahar Sinai. So even though we're going to be a few chapters in after the erection of the tabernacle, nonetheless, the Torah talks about Bahar Sinai, but it is talking about it as a reference to the past. And so the Torah is remaining consistent. And how do we know it's a reference to the past? Well, this must have taken place before the erection of the tabernacle, since 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, died at the hand of God immediately after the tabernacle became functional on the first day of Nisan in the second year. In verse 4 of that same chapter, Numbers 3, where reference is made to the death of Nadav and Avihu, the Torah, in explaining where this took place, adds the words Bamidbar Sinai, in the wilderness of Sinai, although it could have written at Mount Sinai, Bahar Sinai. At that time, the Israelites were still encamped at Mount Sinai. So he is pointing out that the Torah is being exceedingly careful with these seemingly trivial prepositional phrases of location, that it switches from one verse to the next, from the pre-tabernacle to post-tabernacle, from the location at Har Sinai, when the tabernacle was not yet completed, to Bamidbar Sinai, when the tabernacle was completed. Even though nothing else had moved at that point, once the tabernacle was erected, the focus shifted from the mountain of Sinai to our journey through the wilderness of Sinai, because we were now, in a sense, bringing Sinai with us. We were bringing that experience of God with us in the continuation of our journeys. And so the focus shifted from the mountain to the Mishkan, to the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. Does that make sense? I'm not seeing any interruptions. So let's go ahead. Oh, sorry. Let's go ahead and take a look at Rashbam on verse number 2. And as you can see here, after that, he has nothing else to add until verse 19. So he is talking about the census taking that we find in verse 2. From this point on, the Israelites were headed for the land of Israel, and all males over the age of 20 were enlisted in the army for that purpose, because on the 20th of the second month, the Torah speaks of the people leaving the region of Mount Sinai, the cloud having lifted off the tabernacle and begun to move ahead of the people. And he points out, you can look in Numbers 10 for more on this idea. Moses invited his father-in-law Yitro to accompany the people who were now journeying towards the promised land. We are now moving rather than stationary. God issued the command to count the people so that one could keep track of how many soldiers there were. And as the editor points out that this would have also allowed them to keep track if there were casualties during a battle. So Rashbam is pointing out that the census that's happening here in verse number 2 is not just an idle curiosity by God or Moses of how many people there were. Indeed, God knows, obviously, how many people there are, but is instead a necessary precursor to the planning of the entry into the land of Israel, where they know that they will encounter some resistance. And as such, this has a very practical, very military purpose behind it, and should be read with that in mind. Okay, thus far, Rashbam. Any questions on Rashbam before I close his little column and we look at our other commentary? Okay. So now we have Torah on the left, Chizkuni in the middle, and Rashi on the right. So let us take a look over here at some Rashi commentary and see what he has to add to this conversation. And he is immediately going to begin with a slightly less practical look at the census, and instead we'll see a different focus. So here we have this same first verse, the preamble of God talking to the people here to prepare them to take the census. And why are they doing this? Because they were dear to him. He, meaning God, counts them, the people of Israel, every now and then. When they went forth from Egypt, he counted them. See Exodus 12:37. When many of them fell in consequence of having worshipped the golden calf, he counted them to ascertain the number of those left. And Rashi gives commentary on Exodus 30:16 on that point. When he was about to make his Shekhinah dwell among them, that is to say, when he commanded them to make a tabernacle, he again took their census. For on the first day of Nisan, the tabernacle was erected, Exodus 40. And shortly afterwards, on the first day of Iyar, he counted them, which is where we are right now. The first day of the second month is the first day of Iyar. So Rashi is giving us a more emotional and less practical description of why we are doing the census right now. He's not arguing about whether or not this is a military census or whether or not this is a preparation for going to Israel, as Rashbam had suggested. But he is also pointing out that emotionally, it seems that God does not only count when there is a very mundane practical purpose. Sometimes it seems that God counts because he is concerned, that it shows his affection for the people, his desire for them to be well and do well. So when they leave, or when they mess up and many of them die, or when he is planning to work together on them, like live with them with the Shekhinah, then he will count and make sure that he knows and they know who they are. All right, moving on to verse 1 from Chizkuni. He has a different take, slightly, on this idea of in the wilderness of Sinai. So in the wilderness of Sinai, at what location did God speak to Moses? Chizkuni asks. Well, from the tabernacle. Before the tabernacle had been erected, God had communicated from the top of Mount Sinai. So here he is echoing the longer ideas of Rashbam. From the day the Ten Commandments had been given, God's presence had not moved away from Mount Sinai until the day after the tabernacle had been erected on the 1st of Nisan of the second year, as we have been told in the Talmud. And on the 1st of the second month, where we are now, in the second year of the Exodus, regarding all other matters, the 1st of Tishrei was considered as the first day of the new year. Something that people are often startled to find out is that in Judaism, we actually have multiple new years, multiple times within the year that we call it a new year. That's not unusual, really. Even in the secular calendar, we will have a January 1 year. We will also have maybe a fiscal year. People will have a tax year. There is a school year. We have lots of years even in the secular world. We just don't quite think of it that way. In Judaism, we're more explicit about these things. And he is pointing out that when we count from the Exodus, then indeed Nisan is the beginning of the year. And when we count holidays, we cycle them from Nisan to Nisan. But in most other respects, such as counting actual numbered years, Tishrei, when we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, is the new year. So moving on to verse number 2, let me just line him up and then move back to our Rashi. So where we have again Rashi talking about the taking of the census here, that this should be done according to their families, meaning in order to ascertain the number of individuals in each tribe. So what Rashi is pointing out to us here is that it didn't have to be divided this way. There could have been a census. Indeed, there have been prior censuses. There have been prior counts that looked at the people as a whole, a total number. At least that was the way it's been presented. Here, however, we are going to get counts that are broken down tribe by tribe by tribe. And that seems unusual, and Rashi is drawing our attention to it. Indeed, these counts are going to be done levet avotam by the houses of their ancestors, of their fathers, one whose father belongs to one tribe and his mother to another tribe shall take his stand with the tribe of his father. So Rashi here, talking from the words of the Talmud, is pointing out that by specifying not just that they will be counted with their families, but will be counted by the houses of their ancestors, is pointing out that we should hear that word avotam is not only ancestors, but also literally their paternal father, their paternal line, that when we count them, we have to choose whether they would be counted in their father's tribe or their mother's tribe. And for this purpose, we are counting them according to their father's tribe. But that's the way that this will break if you have somebody that is coming from a mother of one tribe and a father of another. Now, notice that this also implies that there is nothing inherently wrong or different about what the mother's tribe might be and its importance to a family, simply that in order to make sure that people are counted properly and arranged properly for this purpose, that one or the other has to be chosen. All right, the connection says it's back. Let's hope it is. I have no idea how much the YouTube feed will be messed up, but I will carry on as best as I can, as we always do. Just a second. Why is it doing that? Because it's not sharing the screen. That's why. Cut the screen out. Let's go back and put that up. Okay. So I believe where we had gotten to was the Gilgulotam, which are this idea here of it's put is by head at the end. It's a little awkward to translate, Here, Rashi is telling us that this means by means of the shekels, meaning that there will be the count, the coin per person, and that is how it will be done. It's trying to make sure that we understand that this census is still following the rules that were laid out back in the book of Shemot and Kitisa, when we talked about the first census that was done there, that there has to be an intermediary object for the counting, that we are not counting people, we are counting the coins the people dropped off. So that is the insight that Rashi is trying to give us. Now, when we get to Chizkuni on this verse, Chizkuni would like to add a little bit that as we take account of the sum, meaning as we add up the entirety of these people, that seeing that this was within 20 days, seeing that within 20 days the Israelites would break camp and start marching towards the Holy Land, as reported in chapter 10 of verse 29, that's the purpose here, that they are about to set off on a journey. Again, bringing in an abbreviated version from what we saw in Rashbam. And here we get into verse 3. And verse 3, again, is this reminder that it is Aaron and Moses that are taking care of this issue for the 20-year-olds and up. And Rashi tells us that no one less than 20 years of age goes forth to the host. That if you are not yet 20 years old, you are not eligible for the draft. Host here is, of course, the biblical term for an army group, and we are being told that there is a limit on the age, that you don't draft 15-year-olds into the army. They have to be 20 years up in order to go fight. Chizkuni also wants to talk about the age here, and he says that from that age and up, males were considered as mature enough to serve in the army. So he is giving a very practical explanation here, that this 20 years old line is not arbitrary. It's not just because they stop being a, quote, teenager, but that there is an actual maturation that happens, that an 18 or 19-year-old is simply not reliably mature enough to go off and serve in battle. And based on this verse, our sages at the end of chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, made the well-known statement, when having attained the age of 20, one is fit to join the pursuit. That the perhaps hot-headedness and perhaps impulsiveness of a teenager is something that we can certainly celebrate and make plenty of movies about, but we also do not want them joining in when things are as serious as an actual pursuit or an actual battle. That we need people of more stable disposition once it starts getting that level of difficult situation. And then, as he points out, that everybody that is able to go out for to join the group of Israel, that the repetition of this word excludes the mixed multitude who have joined the people only at Exodus, meaning that this count is only Yisrael, is only of the people that were already Israelites prior to the Exodus commencing, and that the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude that joined on, were not included in the count. That doesn't mean that they were ineligible to be together or to help serve, but it does mean that the numbers that we will count are of the people that are specifically from the Israelite tribes prior to the Exodus taking place. That's, of course, why we are going to count tribes or count tribally when we get to that point in just a minute. But first, we have to get the reminder in verse 4 that we are counting them together with the leaders of each tribe, as Rashi points it out, that these are not just random people, but when you number them, when you do the census, there shall be with you the princes of each tribe. That there needs to be a representative that is a respected leader of each tribe, and that person will be there to guide and verify, to participate in the actual counting. Now, it might be a little bit unusual to think, why are we worried about who's counting what. I mean, certainly there shouldn't be any problems with this. And yes, we know that Moses and Aaron would be honest and correct accountants for all of this. But since we are talking about putting together a census that will outline the proportional burden in battle for the different tribes, I think it was amazingly astute to include representatives of all of those tribes so that it would be very apparent that no favoritism was taking place, that it would be very clear that all of the counts were done correctly, and that the larger tribes would shoulder certain responsibilities based upon their size, and the smaller tribes would do what they could comparatively to their size of their tribe, that all of this would be done appropriately. And sometimes the best way to get best results is to start off with that transparency rather than try to convince people after the fact. So Rashi draws our attention. Now you'll notice that at this point, Rashi jumps to verse 16. And like I said at the outset, this is one of the reasons why in particular I wanted to bring Chizkuni today, because some of his insights on these intermediate verses I find very interesting, and no one commentator can do it all. So Rashi is going to get a little break, and we are going to continue here on verse 5 with Chizkuni. Get the Torah text onto the right line. So verse 5 begins the list of the names of the princes that will stand alongside Moses and Aaron during the counting. And it begins, of course, with the tribe of Reuven. And as we learn that this is Elitzur ben Shedeur, that this is the person that is mentioned. Chizkuni tells us he was mentioned first as the original Reuven had been Yaakov's firstborn son. All right, so very important family dynamic insight being brought here, that there is still a predilection, a tendency to follow certain patterns when dealing with the different tribes. And here we are seeing that Reuven is being listed first, even though he is not the largest tribe and certainly not the most important tribe. But this is because the original Reuven, the actual Reuven that was born to Jacob, was the first child born to Jacob. As such, he does have a primary position in this list, and thus he is put first and foremost when the list of the princes has begun. Now, hold on to that, because by the time we get to the end of this and then begin the actual counting, we are going to see that that is not 100% followed throughout the actual counting. So the first way to learn Torah is to notice the details, so then you can compare and contrast whenever other parts come up that are similar. So we move to verse 6, and we hear that in verse 6 that there was Shlumiel ben Suri Shaddai, and it is explained that this was his name. Now, why is it being explained as his name? Well, because it doesn't really sound like a name. Suri Shaddai, my rock is Shaddai, sounds like a title that someone would make towards God. You know, this is my rock, this is my God, Shaddai is my rock. I mean, it's a proclamation. It's not like Frank. It's not a name. But Chizkuni is pointing out that no, indeed, this was his name, and that we do have other names for this person. We can find some in Numbers 25. We can also find in the discussion in Sanhedrin, where there is more conversation. But this is one of the features of Hebrew, especially in the naming conventions, that oftentimes it will be difficult to know whether the word is a name or whether the word is a title. And here Chizkuni is trying to guide us that no, in fact, this was an actual name. Moving on to verse 10, we get to the complication that I mentioned when we read through the Torah of Livnei Yosef, for the children of Joseph, that they are mentioned after the children of Leah. And here we see again, like there are two of them. And this is done as a sign of respect to their mother, Rachel. What does that mean? Well, remember that Jacob had 4 wives. He had Rachel and Leah, And he also had Bilhah and Zilpah, the two handmaidens of Rachel and Leah. So you might have thought, since we began with Reuven, since we began with the firstborn of Leah, that we were going strictly in chronological order of each and every child. And indeed, up until this point, up until verse 10, we had been. But now we deviate, because in the Torah's discussion of the children of Jacob, Rachel does not have her own children first. Her handmaiden has children first. Yet here, as a sign of respect to the mother Rachel, the children of Rachel, her actual own biological children, leapfrog the chronology of the births, and they are given a higher status. Now notice, they could have gone first, meaning that Rachel being the most beloved wife and Joseph being the most beloved son could have gone first at the list altogether, and Reuben could have come later. But the Torah kept the order of the firstborn and then all of those children that came from Leah. And now it is jumping to Rachel. So it is compromising, if you will, providing respect and honor to Rachel, but also providing respect and honor to Reuben and his brothers as being the firstborn for Jacob. And it is that balance, that compromise, that way of trying to satisfy the needs of all of the members of the family, and here all of the members of the tribes, that is a beautiful insight and instruction into how we guide ourselves in our own relations, especially those that can come in complicated family matters. But we're not done yet, because Cooney also points out the Torah mentions the younger son Ephraim first, as this is what their father Yaakov did when he blessed them before his death. Remember the crossing of the hands that Jacob made when giving the blessings to Ephraim and Manasseh, to put the right hand on the younger son. So here, the Torah is continuing to follow the order in which Jacob had placed the two boys. Ephraim and Manasseh, though grandsons of Yaakov, are mentioned before his son Binyamin. As combined, they represent Rachel's firstborn son, Joseph. And Chizkuni just draws our attention to the family tree, that even though Ephraim and Manasseh are younger than Benjamin, being grandchildren, after all, of Jacob, they are given a initial status as being children of Rachel, because they represent together the children of Rachel, because they are the children of Joseph. All right, hopefully that made sense. Let's go ahead and take a look at verse 12, where we are talking about Dan. Well, we're not talking about Dan, we're again talking about family dynamics. Dan is mentioned first among the four sons of the concubines, as he was the firstborn among them. Asher is mentioned next to him, as his tribe was the leading one in the group of tribes encamped around his flag. This is followed by Gad, who was the firstborn son of Leah's servant maid. So what Chizkuni is trying to point out is that we get into a real bit of a head scratcher. It looked like we were going firstborn biological, and then we would go firstborn handmaidens, but it gets a little mixed. And he's pointing out that there were additional considerations, in particular, the way that the tribes are going to be arranged in the encampment around the Ohel Moed, around the tent of meeting. So this listing is not purely for the chronology of birth mixed in with the respect of the different mothers, but there is also the current needs of how people are going to be arranged. And we can see that by the way the next few names are listed. And now we get down to verse 16. Let's get that there and that over there. And that means we are able to once again turn back to our good friend Rashi to see what his comments are at the end of this section that we've already read. So these were the ones that were called from the congregation, meaning these leaders of the different communities, those who were called upon from every matter, for every matter of importance that happened in the congregation. So he's pointing out that this then becomes a usual matter, that when they are making important decisions for the community, that these same folks will be brought together again as a kind of council representing the leadership of the different tribes. And very instructive there that even though we have Moses, who we know is being instructed by God, who we know is of outstanding character qualities and ability, nonetheless, there is still a council that works with him. There is still the leaders of the tribes to sit and to discuss and to understand and give input on each of the matters that come before the entire community. So it's just a little glimpse into this idea. Now, Hiskuni just gives us a little grammar in his first idea. We don't need to go into it, but then he points out that these heads of the thousands of Israel, that each of the people named here was the head of the thousands belonging to his tribe. That this is reminiscent back to the discussion in Yitro, where we talked about the organization of the courts, and we are talking here about the organization of the families, that there is a distribution of different people who are in charge at different sizes of groupings, of gatherings of people, and that these are the people that are at the top of all of the leadership of their tribe. Okay, and gladly, even with the internet disruptions, we still have time to go on because there are a few more comments that I was really hoping we get to. So let's go ahead and go back into the Torah so that we can understand what they're talking about. So we are picking up in verse 17. And Moses and Aaron took those participants who were designated by name. So they are doing what God had mentioned. And on the first day of the second month, they convoked the whole company, in parentheses of fighters, who were registered by the clans of their ancestral houses, the names of those aged 20 years and over being listed head by head. As Adonai had commanded Moses, so he recorded them in the wilderness of Sinai. And the totals are as follows. Now, we're not going to go into all of this, but just so that you can get a taste of it, the descendants of Reuben, Israel's firstborn, the registration of the clans of their ancestral house, as listed by name, head by head, all males aged 20 years and over, all who were able to bear arms, those enrolled from the tribe of Reuben, 46,500. Of the descendants of Simeon, and the registration of the clans of their ancestral house, their enrollment as listed by name, head by head, all males aged 20 years and over, all who were able to bear arms, those enrolled from the tribe of Simeon, 59,300. Of the descendants of Gad. Okay, wait, hold on. What are we doing with Gad here? Gad would not necessarily fit in this spot, would he? Because he was not mentioned here in our list of the princes. So what's he doing here, number 3 in the list of the census? All right, obviously we're going to have to come back to that when we get there through our commentary. We're going to leave it there, but there are things we have to discuss before we touch on that. But I just wanted to show you the pattern and how immediately it's already a different pattern than we saw from the list of the princes. So beginning with verse 17. And Moses and Aaron took these, says Rashi. Who are these? These are the 12 princes, quite obviously. Who were mentioned? Who were they mentioned to? By Moses. We already know that this is the list. And Rashi is making sure that we understand it's not some new people. And then, as they were declared by their pedigrees, this is a very unusual phrasing as well. V'yit yaldu, what does it mean? Obviously, it comes from that root of yeled, for being born of somebody. So what's going on here? Well, Rashi argues they brought the records of their pedigree, of their ancestry, and witnesses to confirm the prevalent presumption regarding their parentage, so that each might establish his pedigree with regard to the particular tribe. So Rashi is arguing here that when they declare their clans, which is how it's being translated here in the English version of JPS, that what they are actually doing is they are presenting their family trees, that they are showing exactly who they are and bringing some level of witness or proof to establish that indeed each and every one of them belong to the tribe that they are claiming. Chizkuni argues that, yes, this might be that they declared their pedigrees, meaning that they were giving their specific family trees. But another interpretation of this unusual word might be they asked their parents for details of when they had been born in order to determine if they had been 20 years old at the time of the Exodus. So Chizkuni is also saying, well, wait, it could be that they were trying to prove who they were, but, there's some that might argue against that as being completely unnecessary. And after all, you can bring witnesses, but who are you going to bring for witnesses of your birth to a certain family that isn't also part of that family, which can be difficult when you're actually trying to do witnessing in Jewish law, because you can't use a witness that is also affected by the same matter. And so instead, perhaps there was a different point. Maybe that we should read this not as their pedigrees, but maybe it should be more emphasizing that birthing that the root of the word has, that maybe what they were doing was trying to establish who was precisely 20 at the time of the Exodus, because after all, that's what's needed for the census. And as we know, people were not as careful about keeping track of birthdays in the ancient world. Birthdays were not as critical as they are now. And now we've almost turned it into a high art form, if not obsession, that we are always focused on birthdays. But in the ancient world, well, you might not remember precisely when a child was born, because when a child was born, you were usually much more worried of whether they would survive for the first 30 days or for the first couple years. And that meant that you weren't exactly of the same mindset as we are now. And so they had to go back and double check with their parents. Wait a minute, hold on. I know you said I was born, around the time of the Exodus, but exactly when? Was it before or after? Because, we're doing something that matters now. And if it's one day before or one day after, that could make a difference. Now I need to know. And that would be what they were trying to add in this conversation. Continuing with Chizkuni, because as you can see, Rashi stops commentating again for another 40 verses or 30 verses. Chizkuni goes on to tell us about this assembly and census in more detail. So picking up in verse 19, where we are being reminded that this is as the Lord had commanded Moses. These words belong to verse 18, where Moses is reported to have assembled all the people. So what he is arguing here is perhaps a little radical, but it's not unusual, which is that sometimes parts of a verse may seem to better fit in a different verse, that the actual break of the verse may seem awkward. And that's okay for that position to be discussed, because the actual breaking of the verses is according to tradition, according to the way the trope has been applied to them. Obviously, the original Torah, and indeed every Torah since, that doesn't have numbers for each verse as we go through it. It is all just a block of Hebrew. And that's something that is certainly possible. More importantly, he's not telling us that we should edit our Torah and fix it, or that it is broken in any way, but he is trying to remind us that we should read this as being part of verse 18, as a straight continuation. And then he continues with his commentary that he, meaning Moses, counted them in the desert of Sinai. The tribes were counted there, one after another, in the order in which their respective flags had been arranged. He commenced the count with the eldest of Yaakov, Reuben. So now we're going to get our basic understanding here that we are dealing here with the order in which they are arranged around the tent of meeting, and that's going to explain the unusual ordering that happens. So we may have had an honorary list in our first section, but now we are getting a more, if you were standing in one place and you were looking at the tribes and counting them as you turned round to observe them all, this is the way you would do it. As he says, therefore Moses began with Reuben, followed by Yehuda, the leader of all the tribes, and followed by Ephraim and Dan. And Reuben's, which was Israel's firstborn, this point had to be made again, as the first tribe in the marching order was Yehuda. So we are still counting in order of the positioning, but not order of marching, because the Yehuda would actually be the first in the front of how the marching would be done. The reason why this point was made by the Torah at this juncture was to explain that the only reason why he was counted first was that biologically he was the first son of the father. So we are reminded of him being Israel, meaning Jacob's firstborn, just to explain to us why we're starting with Reuben when he's not at the head of the marching order. And then, excuse me, let me get all of our text back here up onto the same line. Come on. Our question about God, of why did we jump to God when we hit verse 24? Well, the Torah ranks him as third in the list, as he was the firstborn of the maidservants of his mother. So his mother was the maidservant of Leah, who also produced Yaakov's firstborn. So again, giving us a justification for the listing of him, which seems again to be slightly out of order. Now, what do we make of all of these lists and numbers and census? Is this the sort of thing that is immediately relevant to most of us? Well, perhaps not. It's, like I said at the beginning, still very important to study every part of Torah, whether we feel it's going to speak to us in a essential way each and every day that we are reading it, because it is in Torah. It was chosen to be preserved by God, and thus it is of supreme importance to continue to study it and try to understand it. But are there things that we can understand from all of this? Well, as I've already made reference to multiple times, the basic idea that here we see really a very intricate attempt to navigate the minefield of the interpersonal relationship of the tribes and all of their different potential rivalries between Leah and Rachel, between the mothers that were the first chosen wives and the handmaidens, whether they will be in the marching order or whether they will have the other honorifics of being firstborns. That all of this is reminding us that there are many different ways to consider, organize, and pay respect to different people in the family, and that many different people will prioritize one over the other. Perhaps being the most populous is what would be most important to one tribe. Perhaps being the firstborn would be most important to a different one. Perhaps being listed first is more important than any other consideration. First, we need to try and see how we can reconcile these, and we're seeing the Torah do a remarkable job here, and remembering that the history of our people has been that rivalry tears us apart. It's impressive to see that there was not great fighting and argument about this, although we will get plenty of complaints and eventual arguments about status when we get to Korach. But we also can see the opposite, which is that just like Ephraim and Menashe, the people here are more disciplined. They are not going to be fighting and arguing. They each feel that they are being respected and honored by the way that they are being treated. And as such, they are not raising a stink. And how often do we forget that lesson? How often do we get so obsessed with our own honor, our own status, our own priorities, that we are thrusting ourselves into confrontation and rivalry with other members of our family or members of our community or members of our businesses, that we forget that strife is unnecessary, that there are better ways to find a way to maintain your honor and dignity and not be walked upon, of course, but to do so in a way that is not continually tearing a community, a group, a family apart, but instead finding a way that all can be honored and all can still march forward together. And at this point, it is staggering how unified the people are and how well behaved they are. That's going to fall apart very quickly in the book of Numbers, in the book of Bamidbar. But for the moment, let us applaud the amazing discipline of our ancestors, and let us seek to emulate it in our own lives and circumstances. All right, so we will wrap that up there. I apologize again for all of the connection problems. I hope it's not too much trouble for our our internet folks. Still trying to get that repaired and replaced, but yeah, well, the less said about that, the happier I'll be. So take care, everyone. And